Let's get one thing straight. If you're here, it's probably because something in your chest still aches. That quiet whisper wondering, why wasn't I enough? That haunting loop of silence after you gave someone your whole heart and they just walked away. But what if I told you something radical? What if I told you the way you're seeing this is completely upside down? You've been fed the same narrative over and over. That getting rejected means you weren't good enough. That silence means you lost. That them moving on fast means you were forgettable. But what if none of that is true? What if the pain you're carrying isn't a sign of your failure, but the birth cry of your power? Here's the problem. Most people think losing someone means they were the one left behind. But let's challenge that. Let's ask a better question. What if they didn't leave because you weren't worthy? What if they left because they never expected you to stop trying? And now that you have, they're terrified. That's not heartbreak. That's revelation. And today, I want you to sit in that with me. Not from a place of bitterness, but from clarity. From strength. From that ancient inner steel that Stoicism teaches us to cultivate. The calm beneath the chaos. Because the real truth? You didn't lose. You got free. You didn't get rejected. You got revealed. And that's what this entire piece is about, flipping the script permanently. This isn't just about relationships. This is about power, presence, and self-worth in a world drowning in emotional fast food. You're about to uncover a truth that doesn't just heal, it recalibrates your soul. We're about to walk through the 7 truths that prove beyond any doubt, you're not the one who lost. You're the one they'll never replace. So before we dive in, ask yourself, are you ready to stop surviving and start seeing? Are you ready to stop defining your worth through someone else's inability to meet you where you stood with grace? Because what's coming next is the part they never saw coming. Stay with me. This isn't a video you want to skip. This is the moment you take your power back. 1. They lost access, not just a person. Imagine they didn't lose just a relationship, they lost a portal. Think about someone who showed up in your life with unwavering care, open arms, forgiveness, consistent presence even when things got messy. You were more than a person to them, and they were more than a person to you. You were a frequency, a doorway, a safe zone. Now that door is closed forever, and that frequency isn't static, isn't recyclable, and certainly isn't replaceable. You might find yourself asking, what does it matter? I'm someone's ex, someone else will fill the vacancy. But that's precisely the point. The world believes that people are interchangeable, that hearts are commodities, that emotional well-being is a fleeting resource. That's a surface-level trap. Stoicism teaches us that our inner virtues, those unwavering commitments to presence, loyalty, and clarity, can't be quantified or swapped out. Once someone mishandles or discards them, there's literally no going back. That quiet presence you offered, night after night, it wasn't insurance. They treated it like one. And now they're locked out, not just of a person, but of a dimension of your soul they never learned to respect. Think of it like this: you weren't a temporary lifeline. You were a sanctuary. You listened without needing to be heard. You showed empathy without needing validation. You held space without wanting to fill it with your own noise. And they, blinded by familiarity and entitlement, sneered at it. They assumed you were a constant, a never-ending supply. They forgot that the portal required careful tending, that respect, boundaries, authenticity, stoic relationships, they're not freebies. They're earned and maintained through mutual awareness and inner architecture. And when they stopped meeting you where you were, they didn't just lose you. They lost access to the person you were at your best. Now you're walking away, not angry, but resolute. That resolve is a boundary. It's not silence out of bitterness. It's silence out of boundary. You're saying, no more entry. Not because you lack love, but because you carry love, too much for someone who only offered echoes. They thought they were losing someone. In reality, they're losing something more sacred. That active, unwavering version of you doesn't exist anymore in their life. And that's a reality that can't be undone by reconciliation texts, nostalgic photos, or excuses. That version has evolved, and they're no longer in the room. What's clutch about this truth, and why Stoic relationships come so naturally to this revelation, is that Stoicism reminds us not to wish for things to remain unchanged. Our strength is found in practice, preparation, and peace in motion. You adapted. You grew. And they stayed behind. So when you stepped away, they weren't just stepping out of your life, they stepped off the stage of your next act. Here's the shift in perspective: you didn't lose them. You lost the opportunity to reduce your presence to someone else's willingness to hold space. You lost the expectation that someone else would reciprocate your energy just because you gave it freely. You lost the old version of yourself that believed emotional access was permanent. But what you gained is far more powerful, a version of you that understands emotional sovereignty, that sees how Stoic relationships are built on mutual respect and not emotional handouts. Ask yourself, which version of you do you want to live as? The one who begged for echoes, or the one who stands outside the portal, arms folded, knowing its absence is protection? Because now that door is closed, they can't cross that threshold again, not without meeting the new you. And meeting the new you means accountability, authenticity, consistency. That's risk. And they left risk behind, not you. Your emotional architecture, your integrity, your unapologetic respect for your own boundaries. These aren't facts that change. They don't depend on their input. That's Stoicism in action. When they walked away, they walked out of context. They lost the ability to co-author the new you. They lost access not just to a person, but to everything you stood for: depth, clarity, healing, loyalty embodied in action. And now, even if they try to come back later, they'll find the door locked and the portal silent. You're no longer available. Not because you're cruel, but because you're sovereign. You hold your own peace, your own fuel, your own narrative. You stepped off the emotional treadmill. You stopped offering access for free. That shift in posture, that is victory. So the difference between being lost and lost access isn't semantics. It's ownership. It's recognition that you are not disposable. That love, done right, cannot be recycled into silence forever. That Stoicism isn't about emotional numbness, it's about emotional sovereignty. Emotions are felt, acted on, owned. But they're not tattooed on your timeline waiting for someone to trigger them again. This portal concept throws everything into perspective. They didn't break up with you. They broke up with access. They broke up with reciprocation. And they thought that was enough, until they realized, too late, that they broke up with something irreplaceable. See, Stoic relationships require self-regulation, integrity, and authenticity. You never just showed up, you lived your values even where they couldn't, or wouldn't, reciprocate. That's why they never replaced you. They simply couldn't. No new face, no new voice, no new companion could ever fit the frequency you brought. They lose things all the time. Vaults close. Doors seal. But they lost you. And that's permanent. 2. Your energy was the difference. Let's break something open, something deep and often ignored. When they walked away, they didn't walk away from a name in their contact list. They didn't walk away from a string of texts or weekend dates or shared playlists. What they truly walked away from was energy. Your energy. And now, that energy is what they miss the most. You know why? Because it's the one thing they can't replace. You see, you weren't just kind. You were present. You weren't just funny. You were aware. You weren't just available, you were attuned. You read silence. You held space. You asked questions no one else thought to ask. You followed up when they weren't fine, even after they said they were. You knew the texture of their voice when they were tired, anxious, irritated, overwhelmed. That's not surface. That's spiritual depth. That's the power of real presence. And that's energy, intuitive, intelligent, and rare. So when they try to recreate that feeling with someone new, when they post the selfies, when they swap out the body in the picture but not the spirit in the memory, it never quite fits. The laugh sounds different. The touch doesn't heal. The silence feels heavier. And no matter how hard they try to mimic the peace you brought, it turns hollow. That's not them replacing you, that's them running. That's not love found, it's noise injected into silence they don't want to face. Here's the thing, when you love deeply, when you walk through life carrying emotional fluency and empathy, when you embody what Stoic relationships strive for, clarity, presence, balance, you leave echoes. People don't just forget the way you made them feel. They remember it in contrast to everything that comes after. Every new smile they try to fake, every new hand they hold without history, becomes a comparison. And the energy doesn't lie. It doesn't fade. It just lingers. The reality? They're not haunted by your face. They're haunted by what your presence did for them. Your energy was the calm in their storm, the anchor in their chaos, the mirror they couldn't shatter. They didn't just lose comfort. They lost clarity. Because energy doesn't manipulate. It reveals. You didn't show up to control them, you showed up to see them. And that seeing, that honest, raw emotional vision, was the scariest thing they ever felt. Not because it hurt, but because it was real. And here's the paradox. They weren't ready for what you brought, but they'll never find it again. Why? Because people think energy can be duplicated. They think loyalty, depth, care, those things live in everyone. But the truth? Energy is the most non-replicable force on earth. You can find someone who looks better, who says the right things, who checks all the performative boxes. But they won't know how to love without pretense. They won't carry that intuitive, stoic presence that simply feels safe. Because that can't be faked. That comes from soul maturity, from the kind of internal quiet stoicism fosters, where peace is the loudest message you send, even when you say nothing. Now they sit in spaces where your voice used to echo, trying to replace your comfort with convenience. And it doesn't work. Because convenience doesn't nurture. It distracts. It doesn't see, it uses. You didn't just stay up talking to them. You stayed with them through the storm. That's not convenience. That's commitment. And now, the emptiness they feel isn't a void of people, it's a void of connection. The connection they had when your energy wrapped around them like protection. Let me ask you, have you ever felt like someone tried to replace you too fast? Like days after everything shattered, they were already posting someone else, already out laughing, already acting unbothered? You weren't crazy to feel that sting. But you were mistaken if you thought it meant you were forgettable. Fast replacements aren't signs of emotional strength. They're signs of avoidance. They're a cover-up for the emotional earthquake your absence created. Remember, people don't replace energy. They replace proximity. They replace comfort zones. But when someone truly carried your peace, your care, your wisdom, the way you made breathing easier when everything was heavy, they never walk away unaffected. And here's what Stoicism teaches us. What is rare must be held in clarity, not clutched in desperation. You gave them something sacred. They treated it like it was common. Now they live with that mistake, quietly, constantly. The late night scrolling? That's not curiosity. That's craving. The old messages they reread but never reply to? That's regret. The new people they surround themselves with who never quite get them. That's reality setting in. You weren't just a body. You were a light source. A sanctuary. And your energy wasn't optional. It was a gift. And don't think for a second that your growth isn't noticed. Oh, it is. Every time they see you thriving, glowing, soft in your silence, that hits. Not because you're doing better, but because you're doing better without them. That's the power they never thought you'd claim. That's stoic resilience. That's choosing stillness over chaos, clarity over games. You weren't playing a role. You were offering something divine, and now, divine doesn't return to dysfunction. So if you're still wondering if you mattered, if you left a mark, let me end that question for good. You didn't just leave a mark. You redefined the standard. You changed the way they feel connection. And now that you're gone, every new voice, every new laugh, every new body, they're not replacements. They're comparisons. Your energy became the measure. And it can't be mimicked. Let them pretend. Let them laugh louder, post more, move quicker. None of it touches what you gave. That's the irony. They tried to make you feel like you were too much. Now they're starved because no one offers enough. And here's where you take your power back. You stop wondering why they couldn't hold it. You stop asking if they're happy. You stop needing closure from someone who was never open to begin with. You gave light. They chose shade. Now they walk in it. Your presence wasn't a placeholder. It was sacred. Your energy wasn't too intense. It was too real. You weren't disposable. You were a damn sanctuary. So breathe. Smile. Own it. Because while they're out searching for the comfort they lost, you're building it within. That's the beauty of Stoic relationships. They aren't driven by validation. They're built on truth. And the truth? You were never the one who lost. You were the one they couldn't keep up with. And now, they'll spend years trying to find in others what they destroyed in you. And if you're still here, still listening, still feeling that fire rise in your chest, like and comment. Number 1. If this video hits you right where you needed it. Let's light up the comments. Let's own this truth together. And don't forget, subscribe for more videos that don't just speak to your pain, but rebuild your power. This isn't just a channel. It's a return to everything you forgot you were. 3. They called you too much because they weren't enough. They didn't say you were too much because they meant it. They said it because they couldn't handle what they saw when they stood next to your truth. Let that settle. Think about how many times they used those words to shrink your presence. Too sensitive, too emotional, too needy, too intense. But what if that wasn't a judgment on you? What if it was a confession of their own inadequacy? The truth is, you were never too much. You were too real for someone living in pretense. You were too present for someone drowning in avoidance. You were too expressive for someone who only communicated through withdrawal. And that, my friend, wasn't your flaw. That was your mirror. And they couldn't look into it without flinching. Stoicism teaches us not to suppress emotion, but to clarify it. It teaches us that discipline of the soul doesn't mean silence, it means truth aligned with peace. You lived aligned. They lived blurred. That's why they collapsed under your clarity. What did they really mean by too much? They meant, you saw me before I was ready to be seen. They meant, you loved me deeper than I was willing to dive. They meant, you gave effort, and I only had excuses. You were full, and they were trying to make you believe that fullness was a flaw. But in reality, you weren't overflowing. You were surrounded by people too shallow to understand depth. And here's the rawest part of it all. They didn't just say you were too much. They made you believe it. They made you doubt the parts of you that were sacred. They made you apologize for needing connection. They made you overthink every message, every gesture, every silence. They conditioned you to think that asking for effort meant begging, that having standards meant being controlling, that vulnerability was a weakness. But all of that? Projection. Their emotional immaturity became your emotional guilt. But not anymore. Not now. You've grown. You've peeled off the labels they put on you. You've seen that intensity isn't instability, it's investment. That emotion isn't drama, it's data. That care isn't clinginess, it's courage. And what they called too much was you asking them to rise. Rise into awareness. Rise into accountability. Rise into a kind of relationship that doesn't settle for half-hearted affection masked as love. So ask yourself, why did they flinch every time you stood in your truth? Because every time you did, they saw their lack. You didn't make them feel small. Their refusal to grow did. And rather than rise with you, they retreated. They ran. They labeled. They minimized. That's not because you were wrong. That's because they weren't ready. Let's be honest. How many times did you lower your volume so they could feel louder? How many times did you edit your emotions so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable? How often did you hide your questions, your doubts, your needs just to keep the peace? And how long did it take before that silence started screaming inside of you? You tried to shrink. You tried to be digestible. You tried to meet them in the shallow end, hoping they'd eventually swim deeper. But people don't grow when comfort is their priority. They grow when truth shakes them. And you were the earthquake they never prepared for. But now, the shift has happened. You've stopped shrinking. You've stopped apologizing. You've stopped performing. That version of you, the one who tried to fit into their emotional bandwidth, that version is gone. And now you're sitting in the truth. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only place that's real. And here's what they didn't realize when they said you were too much. They were declaring their limits. They weren't insulting you. They were exposing themselves. They were telling on their own unreadiness, their own emotional malnourishment. And the ones who are starved for self-awareness will always call abundance excess. But abundance isn't the problem. Lack is. Immaturity is. Confusion masquerading as freedom is. And when you dared to stand in clarity, they blamed the light for being too bright. They called your transparency manipulation. They called your loyalty desperation. They called your accountability overreacting. But you know what those were? Defensive reactions to a love they never thought they'd have to earn. They were used to situations where ghosting was acceptable, where silence was power, where detachment was romanticized. And here you came, not with games, but with truth. And that truth required something most people aren't willing to give: effort. So let me offer you this. When they said you were too much, what they really meant was you were more than they could match. And that's not your failure. That's your confirmation. You were never meant to shrink. You were meant to expand. You were never meant to lower your love. You were meant to level up your standards. And now you don't just love wisely, you love selectively. The greatest revenge isn't spite. It's alignment. It's standing in a room where once you had to whisper to be accepted and now you speak with full volume, knowing your voice isn't too loud, it's finally in the right place. And that, right there, is what Stoicism teaches. Don't waste energy convincing someone of your worth. Spend energy becoming someone so whole that the room either rises to meet you or fades into the background. You weren't too much. You were the measure, the lesson, the invitation to emotional adulthood. And when they declined that invitation, it wasn't your value that took the hit. It was their capacity. So what now? You don't walk around proving anymore. You walk with presence. You don't explain yourself endlessly anymore. You let your silence speak. You don't bend to be digestible. You trust the right people will never ask you to shrink. And most of all, you forgive yourself. Not for being too much, but for believing it was ever true. That was never your weight to carry. That was never your truth to absorb. That was their discomfort masquerading as your defect. And now that you've seen the truth, there's no going back. You don't mourn the old version of yourself, you celebrate the one who stood up. The one who said, enough. The one who chose expansion over appeasement. Because now you're aligned. Now you're clear. And the people who meet you here, where you are full, grounded, emotionally intelligent, they won't call it too much. They'll call it refreshing. They'll call it inspiring. They'll call it what it always was, real. And that's where we leave this part. Let the old echo fade. Let their words lose power. Because from here forward you don't shrink. You expand. 4. Rejection wasn't a loss, it was a mirror. There's a moment, usually late at night, when the world goes still, when you look back and ask, why did they leave? The temptation is to turn inward and blame yourself. To believe that their rejection was evidence of your inadequacy. But what if we flip the lens? What if rejection wasn't about your worth, but their reflection? Let that settle. Let it stir. Rejection hurts, not because of what was lost, but because of what it seems to say about us. But here's what Stoicism teaches us to ask. Is that pain a judgment on our value, or a mirror exposing someone else's inability to love well? And the more you dig into that question, the clearer the answer becomes. You weren't too emotional. You weren't overwhelming. You weren't unlovable. You were just clear. And clarity terrifies people who are addicted to confusion. Think about how many times they disappeared when things got real. How often they paused when emotions deepened. How many excuses they made when you asked for simple, honest connection. It wasn't that you demanded too much, it's that you stopped tolerating too little. That mirror you held up didn't lie. It reflected back their avoidance, their inconsistency, their unwillingness to grow. And they couldn't stand it. You ever noticed how they'd laugh off serious conversations? How they'd ghost after moments of intimacy? That wasn't random. That was self-preservation, on their end. Because when they looked at you, they didn't just see someone who cared. They saw accountability. They saw effort. They saw someone who wasn't going to let them coast in apathy. And instead of rising to the moment, they folded. Because rising meant becoming someone they didn't know how to be. You didn't get rejected because you failed. You got rejected because you revealed. Every time you showed up with compassion, every time you forgave, every time you explained, every time you asked them to meet you halfway, you revealed their emotional laziness. And instead of meeting the mirror with maturity, they shattered it. That's what people do when they're scared to see their own reflection. They blame the one holding the glass. So let's reframe it. That moment they left? That wasn't a loss. That was protection. That was life clearing space. That was a divine recalibration. That was the universe, or if you prefer, the rational order of things, removing someone who couldn't handle what you brought. Because what you brought wasn't temporary. It wasn't a vibe. It wasn't an act. It was depth. It was growth. It was presence. And presence requires participation. And the mirror you held wasn't just any mirror. It was a clean one. It didn't distort their image. It didn't flatter their ego. It showed the cracks. It showed the apathy. It showed where they said they were ready, but never were. That's why they bailed. Not because you were too much, but because they couldn't hide anymore. And here's the irony. They'll try to twist it. Say you were clingy. Say you were dramatic. But what they're really doing is gaslighting their own fear. Because deep down, they know. They know you were real in a world full of fakery. They know you didn't just date, you connected. You didn't just show up, you stayed. You didn't just love, you invested. And they weren't ready for that level of exposure. So they ran. Not from you, but from themselves. And if you're wondering why it still hurts, remember this: rejection doesn't just hit the ego. It hits the hope. The hope that maybe, this time, someone would finally see you fully and choose to stay. But don't confuse pain with failure. Pain is feedback. And in this case, it's telling you that you were the truth, and they weren't ready for it. That's what Stoicism brings to the table. Not suppression, but sorting. Sorting between what belongs to us, and what belongs to others. And the rejection you faced? That belongs to them. That's their fear. Their lack. Their reflection. And you were just a mirror. You ever notice how people project when they're exposed? The moment you stop playing small, they call you selfish. The moment you demand clarity, they call you aggressive. The moment you detach, they call you cold. But those aren't your traits. Those are their fears trying to make sense of your strength. And strength, real strength, makes people uncomfortable, especially those who have none. So when you feel tempted to look back and wonder, what if I had been less intense? Ask a better question. Why did they choose comfort over clarity? Because that's what they did. They chose temporary ease over long-term growth. They chose ego over intimacy. And the irony? That choice haunts them far more than your love ever did. Because here's what happens after the mirror breaks: regret sets in. Not right away. Not in the honeymoon phase of their next distraction. But later. Quietly. When the noise fades. When the shallow conversations wear thin. When the new attention stops feeling new. That's when the mirror returns, not in the form of you, but in the form of silence. Of emptiness. Of the echo of your care. They'll never tell you this. But they'll feel it. In the song you introduce them to. In the way the new person doesn't notice what you always did. In the moments of anxiety they can't share with anyone else. That's not just memory. That's consequence. And not because you were perfect, but because you were real. And real? Real is terrifying. Real requires vulnerability. Real asks for effort. Real means showing up, even when it's hard. And people who are still playing pretend can't survive in the presence of real. That's why they left. Not because of a flaw, but because of a force they weren't equipped to face. So if you're walking through this feeling broken, let me offer you something different. You're not broken. You're upgraded. You're seeing clearly. You're feeling deeply. You're moving with purpose. And the people who called that too much, or overwhelming, or dramatic, they weren't telling the truth. They were revealing their limits. Let's bring it home with this. The person who rejected you was never rejecting you, they were avoiding themselves. You didn't fail. You exposed. You didn't collapse. You clarified. You didn't get abandoned. You got rerouted. And now you're in a position of power. Not because you hurt them, but because you stopped letting their confusion define your clarity. And if this resonates, if you've ever held up that mirror and been blamed for what it reflected, like this video and comment number 1 below. I want to know who's reclaiming their power tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because this isn't just a video. This is a movement, a recalibration, a community where truth wins, clarity reigns, and you are never too much. 5. The glow-up was a recalibration, not revenge. They think you're trying to prove something. They think your glow-up, the way you've gotten quieter, stronger, more focused, is about them. That it's all some kind of silent competition. But let's tell the truth here, it's not. This transformation? It wasn't for them. It wasn't aimed at their ego. It wasn't a strategy to win them back. It was a return. A return to yourself. You didn't wake up one day thinking, let me become unrecognizable just so they regret losing me. No. You woke up exhausted. Exhausted from shrinking. From over-explaining. From performing emotional CPR on someone who refused to take responsibility for their own healing. Your glow-up wasn't some calculated play for attention. It was the natural evolution of someone who stopped betraying themselves. See, that's what people don't understand about real growth. It's not loud. It doesn't broadcast itself. It's not dressed in designer logos and thirst traps. It's silent. Stoic. It's done in the dark. It's waking up and deciding to eat better. To move your body not to look good for them, but to feel strong for you. It's saying no when your old self would have said yes just to avoid tension. It's deleting the number without telling anyone. It's protecting your energy like it's sacred, because now you know it is. And here's the thing. That quiet shift? It is noticed. They see it. They feel it. And that's what rattles them. Not because they miss you, but because they never thought you'd stop waiting. They never thought you'd actually follow through on the boundaries you once softly mentioned. They assumed your light would stay available, your loyalty would remain free, your presence would always orbit them like the sun. But now you've gone supernova. You've become your own center. What's more intimidating than someone who doesn't need revenge? Someone who doesn't need anything. That's where you are now. You're not chasing. You're not watching their stories. You're not crafting Instagram captions to get under their skin. You've stopped playing the game completely. And walking away from the game, that is the biggest power move of all. Because you've realized something essential. True revenge isn't rage. It's radiance. It's alignment. It's stepping so fully into your purpose that their memory becomes a footnote, not a chapter. It's knowing that you don't have to burn their name to light your path. You've become the fire. That's stoicism in practice. Not emotional shutdown. Not false detachment. But discipline. Internal mastery. Choosing peace over pettiness. Choosing silence over noise. Choosing real over reactive. You've learned that your emotions are valid, but they don't get to run the show. You feel them. You honor them. And then you act with clarity. And that clarity is what they never expected. The truth is, they thought breaking you would keep you small. That you'd sit in the ruins, waiting for an apology that never comes. That you'd measure your days by whether they liked your post, whether they looked your way, whether they remembered what they let go. But you're past that now. You don't want them to look back. You want them to stay behind. And don't think for a second that this glow-up means you never cried. That you weren't broken, wrecked, gasping on the floor of your own heartbreak. Oh, you were. But that pain? That pain became the gym. That grief became the grind. That betrayal became the blueprint. You took everything they tried to use to destroy you and you repurposed it into self-discipline, into stillness, into wisdom. So now when they look at you, they don't just see someone who moved on. They see someone who leveled up spiritually, emotionally, energetically. And that scares them. Because they realize, they didn't just lose you. They lost access to a version of you they'll never get again. Here's the nuance that no one talks about. You didn't glow up because you were angry. You glowed up because you were done. Done carrying dead weight. Done breaking your own heart just to keep someone else comfortable. Done watering a garden where nothing ever grew. This isn't vengeance. This is vision. And your glow up? It doesn't look like arrogance. It looks like peace. It looks like quiet confidence. It looks like boundaries that don't need announcements. It looks like you smiling to yourself when you wake up, not because everything's perfect, but because you know you're finally aligned with who you were meant to be. And here's what's most beautiful about all of it. You didn't rush the process. You didn't try to skip the grief. You sat with it. You let it teach you. You let it hollow you out, and in that hollow space, you planted new roots. That's not revenge. That's resurrection. So while they're trying to fill the void with distraction, you're filling your life with intention. While they're out trying to prove they've moved on, you've actually moved forward. While they're still seeking outside validation, you've found internal sovereignty. And that is what Stoic relationships are truly about: shared values, not shared wounds. Depth, not drama. Presence, not performance. You're no longer asking, "Do they miss me?" You're asking, "Does this environment nourish my growth?" You're no longer hoping to be chosen. You're doing the choosing. And you're choosing peace over chaos, purpose over confusion, solitude over fake intimacy. So yes, you glowed up. But not to impress. To express. To embody. To evolve. You stopped looking outward for reflection and started becoming your own mirror. You stopped waiting for the apology and started becoming the closure. You stopped begging for consistency and started becoming your own foundation. And when they think back, because they will, they'll remember that you didn't yell. You didn't expose them. You didn't burn their name to the ground. You just got quiet. You got better. And that silence? That silence became your story. That silence became your strength. Because the most dangerous person is the one who doesn't need to be seen to feel valid. The one who can sit alone in a room and know they are whole. And that's you now. You are whole. Not because they came back and said, "I was wrong," but because you stopped needing their words to know your worth. This isn't revenge. This is recalibration. This is the part of the story where the hero doesn't just survive, they transform. Where the pain doesn't just end, it becomes power. Where the past doesn't just fade, it fuels the future. 6. Silence isn't weakness, it's power. There comes a point when the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. No text. No closure. No explanation. Just silence. And the reason it hits so hard is because your silence wasn't how the relationship started. You began with presence. With warmth. With energy that showed up. You were consistent. Available. Patient. You were the one who reached out, checked in, stayed late in the conversation when they needed grounding. You were noise in all the best ways: laughter, comfort, clarity, support. But when your silence arrived, it wasn't a withdrawal of emotion, it was the arrival of strength. People often mistake silence for indifference. But Stoicism teaches something deeper. Silence is the ultimate expression of mastery. It's not about not feeling. It's about not being controlled by those feelings. You didn't stop speaking because you had nothing to say. You stopped because you realized your words were seeds in dry soil. You realized the person you kept trying to reach didn't want to meet you in that garden. So you stopped tending it. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself more. Let's be real, silence is terrifying for people who've gotten used to access. It's unsettling for someone who's used to your immediate response, your predictable empathy, your never-failing support. Because your silence is not just quiet, it's a mirror. A reflection of every time they ignored your needs. Every moment they dismissed your feelings. Every second they assumed you'd always be there. And now that you're not, their mind is the one making noise. Not yours. You used to stay up wondering what you did wrong. Replaying conversations. Looking for your flaw. Blaming your honesty, your depth, your love. But now they're the ones doing that. They're the ones scrolling through memories, typing out messages they'll never send, hovering over your name with regret wrapped in hesitation. And that silence you gave them? It's not empty, it's loaded. It says everything they once refused to hear. Because silence does what words can't. It forces self-reflection. It removes the shield of debate. It eliminates the possibility of denial. When there's nothing left to argue with, they're left to argue with themselves. And if they didn't care, they wouldn't be haunted. They wouldn't check your profile. They wouldn't show up in your story views at 3 a.m. They wouldn't talk about you to mutual friends while pretending they've moved on. Silence isn't absence, it's evidence. Evidence that something sacred was mishandled. You didn't stop responding because you're cruel. You stopped because you had finally exhausted every version of yourself trying to be heard. And the truth is, people get addicted to loyalty they don't deserve. They grow comfortable with empathy they never earned. But when you finally take that back, not with a fight, but with stillness, it shakes them. Because now they're left without their comfort source. Now they're left with their own thoughts. Now they're left wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were the problem all along. There's a strange peace in knowing you don't owe anyone access. Just because someone once had your time, your trust, your energy, that doesn't mean they're entitled to it forever. Love, real love, isn't infinite in supply when it's being poured into a void. And silence becomes the line in the sand. It's the moment you stop fighting for something they never showed up for. It's the moment you stop proving and start preserving. Stoicism tells us not to react impulsively, to respond with intentionality. And silence is the most intentional response there is. Because it's not reactive, it's decisive. You're not ghosting. You're not playing games. You're choosing peace. You're choosing your own narrative. And if someone finds that unsettling, it says more about the noise they brought into your life than the quiet you've chosen. And here's what silence does that nothing else can: it forces growth. Not just in them, but in you. Because in the stillness, you find your center. You hear your own voice again. You remember who you are when you're not constantly bending to make someone else feel comfortable. And when the noise dies down, when the dust settles from the storm they left behind, you realize the power wasn't in the words. It was in the withdrawal. You gave them chances. You gave them grace. You explained, clarified, forgave, and stayed. You showed them what loyalty looked like, what effort felt like. And they treated it like an option, like something they could pause and return to. But silence? Silence is final. It's the locked door. It's the boundary with no hinges. It's the part where the lesson ends and the consequence begins. And let's be clear, this isn't about ego. It's about energy. It's about recognizing the drain and choosing to close the valve. Because energy, like attention, is currency. And when you stop spending it on someone who keeps giving you emotional debt in return, your savings grow. Your power returns. Your clarity sharpens. They might call your silence petty, cold. They might say you're being dramatic. But all of that is noise. Attempts to pull you back into the chaos. attempts to reopen the door. But you've outgrown the threshold. You don't need their validation. You've found your own. And maybe one day, they'll try to come back. With apologies. With realizations. With stories about how they've changed. But the version of you that's waiting in silence now? That version doesn't exist for them anymore. You've evolved. You've risen. You've built a life where their access code has expired. And that right there is what haunts them more than any word you could have said. So if you're sitting in silence right now, wondering if you made the right choice, wondering if walking away without a speech was strong enough, let this be your confirmation: you did. Because real power doesn't scream. It doesn't beg. It doesn't prove. It just is. And your silence isn't empty. It's sacred. This isn't the part where you look back. This is the part where you stand tall in stillness. Where you realize that silence was never the end of your story. It was the beginning of your sovereignty. And if you felt that, if your silence has been misunderstood, but never misplaced, then like this video and comment, number 1, down below. Let your story echo through this community. Let others know they're not alone in the power of their quiet. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're not just healing here. We're transforming. Together. You've walked through every stage. You've sat with the loss, dissected the rejection, challenged the narrative, and reclaimed your identity. You've begun to understand something most people never grasp. You were never the one who lost. You were the one who gave. Who stayed. Who showed up with consistency in a world that rewards cool detachment. You were the standard in a culture obsessed with options. You were the mirror, the sanctuary, the lesson, and they weren't ready. And now, they never will be. Let's pull this all together. What you thought was rejection was really redirection. That moment of silence, of abandonment, of watching them choose someone else, it felt like a knife to your self-worth. But that pain? That wasn't proof that you were forgettable. It was evidence of how deeply you were involved. That's what most people won't admit. When you care like you did, when you give the way you did, the pain of loss feels heavier. But it's not weakness. It's clarity. It means you were real in a world that plays pretend. You might not get closure. You might never hear the apology. And yet, here you are, still standing. Why? Because part of you always knew this moment was coming. The moment where your inner self would outgrow the space where your love was never fully held. That's what Stoicism teaches us, not to run from pain, but to sit with it, learn from it, and be shaped by it into something unshakable. You weren't meant to be a placeholder in someone else's confusion. You were meant to be your own anchor in clarity. And here's the truth about Stoic relationships. They require mutual investment. You can't carry both hearts. You can't be the foundation and the structure, the warmth and the fight, the healer and the forgiver and the builder. You're allowed to expect someone to meet you there. And if they don't, that's not your failure. That's their reflection. And that reflection? It haunts people long after the door closes. Because they come to realize that what they dismissed as too much was actually everything they never knew how to hold. You've likely already seen signs of this. Those random profile views, that hesitating text that never quite gets sent, that friend who mentions they still ask about you. And while a younger version of you might take comfort in those crumbs, this version doesn't. This version doesn't crave the return of what never served you. You don't sit by the door anymore. You don't refresh the chat. You don't rehearse what you'd say if they reached out. You've evolved past needing to be chosen. Now you choose yourself. And when they remember you, and they will, it won't be because of how loud you were. It'll be because of your stillness. Because of the way your absence created an echo that no one else could fill. Not because you were dramatic, but because you were steady. And steady love leaves a mark. Steady energy doesn't vanish, it transforms the space it once lived in. That's what they're missing now. Not the idea of you. You. Your consistency. Your safety. Your depth. Your memory will live inside of them in contrast to everyone they try to find next. But this story isn't about them. It's about you. About the way you took the mess and turned it into meaning. About the way you stopped chasing and started becoming. About how you remembered the version of yourself that existed before the confusion. Before the gaslighting. Before the exhaustion of loving someone who didn't know how to love you back. That version wasn't lost. She was buried. And now she's here, wiser, calmer, more rooted. You learn that boundaries aren't punishments. They're declarations of worth. You learn that silence doesn't mean giving up. It means finally choosing peace. You learn that healing isn't about waiting for them to regret it. It's about realizing you were always the one worth choosing. You didn't level up to prove anything. You leveled up because you were never meant to stay at their level. You outgrew the pattern. You transcended the noise. You aligned. And no, they won't say it out loud. But that doesn't mean they don't feel it. That voice in their head at 1 a.m.? That's your calm. That stillness when the party ends? That's your echo. That shadow of depth they can't find in their new partner? That's the space you once filled. And every time they try to fake it, to mimic what they had with you, they'll realize something more devastating than loss. That they didn't just lose a person. They lost access. And that access? It's never coming back. You've stopped romanticizing potential. You've stopped confusing effort with begging. You've stopped trying to fix people who are committed to being broken. And in that letting go, you've found what so few ever do: power in detachment, grace in solitude, strength in the quiet. Not because you're hardened, but because you've learned how to soften around the right people and guard your energy from the wrong ones. So where do you go from here? You walk differently. You speak differently. You vet differently. You don't hand out emotional access like it's on sale. You observe. You discern. You show up, but you don't chase. Because you finally understand your value, not just as a partner, but as a whole person. And the people who step into your life now? They don't meet the version of you who tolerated confusion. They meet the version who doesn't shrink. Who doesn't explain basic decency. Who doesn't chase closure. Because you are the closure. That's the beauty of this moment. The beauty of stoicism in relationships. The pain didn't make you bitter. It made you better. It made you clear. It made you resilient. You've stopped giving people unearned emotional intimacy. You've stopped offering your heart to people who are allergic to depth. You've stopped being the bridge to someone else's healing while they throw stones at the water beneath them. Now you're sacred. Not because of ego, but because of earned wisdom. Not because of spite, but because of clarity. You've become the fire that doesn't chase, it transforms. The mirror that doesn't reflect their fears anymore, it reflects your strength. And if they ever come back, it won't be to the version of you who once begged for bare minimum. It'll be to the version they can't reach anymore. And maybe that's the most poetic ending there is. Not revenge. Not regret. Just evolution. Because you were never the one who lost. You were the one they couldn't keep up with. The one who stayed real while they kept pretending. The one who showed up while they disappeared. And now, you've become the one they'll spend the rest of their life comparing others to. Not because you're flawless, but because you were true. And that kind of energy, it doesn't fade. It doesn't fold. And it sure as hell doesn't get replaced. So take a breath. Look in the mirror. You're not the abandoned one. You're not the broken one. You're not the weak one. You are the standard. The lesson. The transformation. You are the reason someone out there will finally realize that not everyone stays forever, but some people leave forever marks. And you? You're that mark. You're not the one who lost. You're the one they'll never replace.